Today I'm going to be speaking about the Chinese fiscal stimulus program, which was announced at the end of last year. I'll be comparing this to an earlier Chinese fiscal stimulus that was implemented following the 1997-1998 Asia crisis. The objective is to see what this earlier experience with Chinese fiscal stimulus suggests about the likely trajectory for Chinese GDP over the next few years. This time, Chinese GDP has actually decelerated much more quickly than it did following the 97-98 Asia crisis. As you can see from the chart, by the time the Asia crisis began in mid-1997, the Chinese economy had already been decelerating for several years. This earlier slowdown that had happened prior to the Asia crisis had been initially started with an austerity program that began in mid-1993. The government had started this austerity program in an attempt to bring down very high rates of inflation. During the 5-year period from the fourth quarter of 1994 until the fourth quarter of 1999, Chinese quarterly year-on-year GDP growth fell by 6.8 percentage points. What's remarkable, as you can see from the chart, is that a slowdown of almost equal magnitude this time has occurred in less than 2 years. Just from the second quarter of 2007 until the first quarter of this year, quarterly GDP growth has slowed by 6.5 percentage points, almost the same magnitude as that earlier 6.8 percentage point slowdown. Last November, the Chinese government announced a 4 trillion Chinese yuan stimulus. This 4 trillion yuan stimulus is an attempt to keep GDP growing at the 8% rate that is believed to be required to keep unemployment from getting out of control. As you can see from the chart, infrastructure spending on transportation, earthquake reconstruction, rural infrastructure, and housing makes up over 80% of this spending, which is expected to be completed in most cases by the end of next year. As was the case following the Asia crisis, the government is characterizing its response to the financial crisis as a combination of what it calls expansionary fiscal policy and stable monetary policy. In the years of the expansionary fiscal policy, which lasted from 1998 until 2004, expansionary fiscal policy meant an average fiscal deficit of 2% of GDP over those years. This year, the fiscal deficit is supposed to be kept to within 3% of GDP. An important similarity between these two fiscal stimulus programs is the emphasis on infrastructure programs, particularly in the areas of transportation and in the power sector. Though there are some differences in the type of projects being selected. For example, in transportation, the emphasis today is mainly on railways, whereas following the Asia crisis, there was an expressway building boom. And this time, in addition to power generation capacity expansion, there will also be significant upgrades to China's electricity grid. Once again, particular sectors have been singled out for government support in the form of administrative measures and subsidies of one sort or another. Again, autos, shipbuilding, machinery, and textiles have made it onto the list of government-supported sectors. An interesting thing following the Asia crisis was that the government refrained from using exchange rate depreciation to support the export sector, preferring to rely more on administrative measures such as export tax rebates. And so far, they're following the same policy. Export tax rebates have risen once again. In the area of stimulating consumption, in the post-Asia crisis period, there were salary increases for state sector workers, subsidies for some low-income workers, and even extra holidays, which were added to the calendar in the hopes of stimulating tourism and consumer spending. This time, there have again been salary increases for some state sector workers. There's also been a program to subsidize home appliance purchases in rural areas, which seems to have been quite successful. And there have been tax cuts for auto purchases, which are believed to have been an important factor behind the auto sales growth in the first few months of this year. In China, two of the central bank's main policy tools are the required reserve ratio for commercial bank deposits and also the one-year deposit rate, which in China is also set by the central bank. So far, the required reserve ratio has been lowered from 17.5% to 14.5%. It's interesting that at 14.5%, this rate is still above the 13% rate in 1998 at the start of the crisis. However, it seems unlikely that this rate will be lowered much further in the immediate future, as there's already quite abundant liquidity in the local banking system. Prior to the Asia crisis, the one-year deposit rate had been quite high, as inflation had been very high in the preceding years. It started from a rate of as high as 10.98% in 1996. As inflation changed to deflation by the end of the 90s, the rate was eventually lowered all the way to 1.98% in 2002. This time the starting point for the one-year deposit rate's much lower, as inflation in recent years has been relatively tame, and having been lowered in a series of steps at the end of last year to 2.25%, it's not clear that there's a lot of room left for this one-year interest rate to be lowered further. Finally, as I remarked before, following the Asia crisis, the exchange rate the US dollar peg was kept unchanged. This time, in his address to the National People's Congress earlier this year, Premier Wen Jiabao said that the exchange rate will be basically stable. So far, what basically stable has meant is that the gradual appreciation that began in the second half when did that start? In 2005, has come to an end, and the exchange rate has basically moved sideways at about 6.8 yuan to the US dollar since the middle of last year.